Hi, Dale. How are you this week?
I'm good, Destin. How are you?
Great. It's been a very eventful week.
It
We
has.
have a lot to talk about.
We do.
So let's get to the exciting stuff first.
Okay.
This week, the federal budget was released. Some of the highlights include, let's wait before we say highlights, but some of the interesting announcements that were made during this budget were obviously the public service job cuts.
hmm
The penny will be eliminated as of, I think, October this year, October,
Yeah, which
November.
was the biggest distraction gimmick that people didn't seem to call out.
Well, I don't know if it has that much of an impact. Well, I mean, it'll make my wallet 20 pounds lighter, but aside from that, I think one of the few pieces that caught the ire of a lot of members of the public was the shortening of the process around environmental assessments. So I think we're going to start there.
Okay.
What about the environmental assessment process do you think really struck a nerve with people? Because what the government is proposing is that they just limit the process to 24 months.
Right, right. And I think it's actually a more problematic suggestion on the government's part
Mm-hmm.
that they can simply just put a timeline on it and that's it. Because the thing with environmental assessments is that it's a very complex relationship between the different levels of jurisdiction. So while the government might say, well, we want to put a 24-month time limit on this, the provincial process may not adhere to that. Same with if there's any municipalities that these projects deal with, their own separate processes may not follow this timeline. Um, so I think that's something that every time everyone lights their hair on fire about, oh my God, they're weakening environmental assessments, I don't know that they've quite necessarily taken into account the various jurisdictional issues involved in environmental assessments.
So, could this be problematic for the feds in the future? Let's say, in a case like the Northern Pipeline,
Right.
could they clash with their provincial and territorial
Absolutely.
counterparts?
Absolutely. And I think that's probably what's going to end up happening in provincial or territorial in terms of some of the pipelines they're talking about in the north, like Mackenzie Gas. Because there are those jurisdictional issues, I think that it's hard for the federal government to say we're going to put a 24-month time limit on this and then that's it, when you've got a province who will say no, 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 we've got our own assessment process and it's not, and it's still going. Our own consultation process is still going, and I think that's going to be something that's really going to trip up the federal government's plans on this particular file.
Okay. Now, besides the conflict that this may cause with provincial and territorial counterparts, to me it seemed that I think a lot of the ire and rage seemed to be placed on the fact that they were making this rule retroactive, and
Right.
and we know what that would involve at
Right.
this point. So aside from the jurisdictional scrapping that
Right.
that may or may not occur, what about that retroactive clause?
That's a good question. I don't know enough about where the Northern Gateway process is along, so it may not have as big of an impact because it's already well in progress. But who's to say? I mean, there's talking about First Nations groups talking court challenges already at this point, so that could again delay the entire process by months or years.
And hopefully, or maybe not hopefully, depending on who you're looking at, that can lead to our first showdown in terms of putting this time limit to the test.
Absolutely.
Okay. I think the other big issue that we need to talk about is the job cuts that are happening to the federal public service. They announced that there'd be about 19,200 job
Right.
cuts over the next 3 years.
Right. And
What
that 2/3 of those are supposed to be through attrition or voluntary.
exactly?
Right.
Now, this is a really interesting question. And I want you to think about this long and hard because, 19,000 in comparison to 60,000 doesn't sound so bad.
Right.
But 19,000 in comparison to zero sounds a lot more severe. Where do you think this budget lands in terms of fairness and fear and anticipation in terms of what's happening in the public service?
That's an interesting question because I think we also need to look at the context in that the public service grew by more than that over the last 6 years that the Harper government's been in place. So we're going back to a staffing level that's still post 2006. So I don't know how really to judge when you put that particular bit of context in. I think there's still going to be challenges within departments, especially as particular skill sets aren't going to be filled because of the attrition or any of those particular cuts that are happening, and there are programs that will suffer. And I think there may be some particular politics around some of the programs that will suffer. But in the overall broader context, I'm not sure how big of an impact it's really going to be. I don't think it's going to be crippling. But on the other hand, I mean, when you're talking cuts in areas like food safety, I also think at the same time we might be looking at a situation where the government's basically inviting another Walkerton or another Listeria outbreak before they need to rethink the particular cuts that they've made in areas like that.
So, I mean, you've already mentioned a couple of departments in there that could be facing heavier challenges than others. So you talked about the Listeria outbreak, and CFIA was one of the departments that were targeted more heavily or bearing a lot of the brunt. Talk about foreign affairs, because there was a lot of foreign affairs cuts and interesting changes to the department that were hidden throughout the budget. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's not just foreign affairs itself. It's actually Canada's entire foreign policy that's going to be affected through the different budget cuts that are happening. Not only the cuts at foreign affairs they're talking about in terms of closing embassies or relocating them or closing foreign residences, which is actually a very big deal in diplomatic circles because of the image that Canada is presenting to the world. There was a great quote I read this last week from the diplomatic community saying, you know, we can't just serve foreign dignitaries ginger ale and Ritz crackers in a basement apartment. That's not putting out a really good image of what Canada is and what we represent as a G8 country. As well, a lot of the residences that we have currently are in very strategically placed locations. Either through proximity to other major centers, be it the UN headquarters in New York or offices in Paris or whatnot. In the Netherlands, you know, the residence we have right now was a gift from the Queen because of the service Canada provided to the Netherlands during the war. So if we start looking at paring down those residences because, oh gosh, they look opulent to our eyes, it's really kind of spiting our faces, cutting our noses up to spite our faces kind of thing in that regard. The other thing, though, when we look at is some of the other cuts that are coming in terms of foreign aid, the cuts at Elections Canada, which were voluntary, are actually going to be cut to foreign election monitoring in foreign countries. And as was announced yesterday, they've cut Rights and Democracy, which was one of our biggest democracy promotion agencies. What this all together seems to signal is that Canada is really pulling back from the world stage in terms of the amount of engagement that we're doing, in terms of the amount of influence that we're able to offer to the world. And I think that when you pair that with the kind of military procurement strategies that we've going on with the F-35, for example, being basically good for a first strike fighter. So it's a shock and awe. It's very much designed to be at the front lines of any overseas engagement. I think that says a lot about where our foreign policy is headed.
2 years ago, or was it last year? You'll have to forgive me. Canada lost a bid to sit on the UN Security Council.
That's right.
I believe Portugal was one of the countries that ended up on the Security Council.
Portugal got the seat that we normally would occupy.
Do you see these? They're separate events in time and their scope, but do you see a linkage between them in terms of what they mean for Canada's image in the world?
Absolutely.
Because at the time, there was a lot of discussion about, Canada's no longer punching above its weight. We don't carry the same sort of noble Lester B. Pearson type ideals that we did many years ago. Is this budget just a confirmation of those thoughts?
It is absolutely a confirmation of it, because part of why Canada didn't get that seat is because we didn't engage with the foreign dignitaries or diplomats in the way that's normally expected, which is really kind of showcasing Canada to them. And I think, we gave them maple syrup samples and little, like, just things like that, which sound really kind of Mickey Mouse in a foreign affairs context. And I think that put a very I would say, cheap image of Canada out to the world, that this isn't something that we're really serious about.
You mentioned the F-35 fighter jets,
Right.
which leads us to our sort of second big discussion point for this week.
Mm-hmm.
On Monday, actually on Tuesday, the
Yeah.
Auditor General released his report, and it was pretty scathing. It condemned the government in terms of its response to some facts and figures that were released by departmental officials.
Right.
He basically said they really didn't do their jobs in terms of fact checking and verifying the information that was presented to them, and the process overall wasn't transparent. What we're laughing because this is a whole barrel of monkeys in and of itself.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll let you sort of jump off and say kind of what this all means in terms of the perception of the government's ability to do a simple procurement process, number one, and what it means in terms of, taking it back or not taking it back, because there's been no announcement to that point.
I don't know. Well, first of all, I don't know if we can say that it's a simple procurement process, because it is a fairly complex process when you've only got a certain limited number of options available for hardware like this. I don't think that there is only just the one platform, because the kind of mission profiles that the F-35 is good for is for a certain kind of mission profile, and it's not necessarily for the kinds of profiles that Canada needs in terms of patrolling the Arctic and all of that. But on top of that, there's a couple of bigger pictures that I think this story needs to really look at. One of them is the fact that the government, I think, had a real reluctance to push back to D&D officials on this file, for the simple fact of they've built up this image of being really patriotic, being super, behind the troops all the way, and I think that part of that reluctance came with not wanting to be seen to be not giving the troops everything they need. So it's we need the best for our troops. This is going to be the best plane, so we're going to have to go ahead with this. And instead of, and I think there was this real fear that if they'd pushed back, someone would have said, "Whoa, you're not supporting the troops." And I think that really scared them into just taking the numbers and facts and figures that they were given at face value without really checking in when contradictory information came out.
But there were opportunities there, because this is not the first time the story had come to this forefront.
This has been going on for 21 months, and I mean we can't forget that this is part of why the last Parliament fell, was on the issue of these jets and the fact that the government was not being forthright with the numbers that they had at their disposal. And I mean that led to the whole contempt of Parliament charge, which led to the fall of the government. So I mean this is still looming large over this entire story, and it then turns into an issue of ministerial responsibility, because it was the minister's job to push back, to say to D&D, "You're telling me these numbers, but the Netherlands is saying this, the United States Congressional Budget Office is saying this, all our allies in NATO are saying this, and yet we still have these numbers that the Auditor General now kind of typifies as being misleading." The minister really should have done his due diligence and put it to the officials to show him the math. And I don't think he did that, because this is a minister who likes to really be pals with the troops. He likes to really show that he's one of them.
So that said, can this procurement contract be salvaged? And when I mean be salvaged, not necessarily with Lockheed Martin and these specific F-35s, but can we start a process, we being the government of Canada, if that's the case, to actually find out what it is we need, what the mission specifics are, and start again?
I think it's possible. I don't think it's too far along in the kind of process in terms of the timeline, because we wouldn't have needed to sign the contract for the F-35 for another couple of years anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there is time in there in which to go back, reevaluate what are our mission requirements, what's going to be our revised statement of operational requirements, because this is one of the things that D&D gamed.
Mm-hmm.
They wrote those requirements to be specifically for the F-35. So if we go back, we redraft those with a broader picture in mind of what our needs are, what kind of mission profiles are we asking these planes to do. Then I think that process can go forward in looking at the other planes that are available, whether it's the Super Hornet or the Typhoon or whatever they are.
And what will the government have to do differently in order to make the process more transparent?
I think they're just going to have to really check their math the whole time and really just show their work.
Mm-hmm.
To go back to, I guess, that kind of a math analogy, you really have to be very thorough and transparent, and these are the operational requirements. These are the different planes that are on the market. These are the requirement. These are the ones that fit best based on this statement of operational requirements, and then kind of work from there. And we'll see what ends up at the end of that process.
Okay. That said, 2 big stories this week. So my next question then is, let's talk about the winner and the loser of the week.
All right.
You go first. Who do you think was the big winner in politics this week?
Big winner. To a certain extent, I think Bob Ray has really taken charge of the F-35 story more than Thomas Mulcair has been able to.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's also just based on his performance and delivery. At the same time, I think Ray may have overstepped his bounds when he said, when he's calling for Harper's head on a pike over this issue, because we all know that that's not going to happen. But in terms of, there's another kind of star that I just wanted to mention this week,
Mm-hmm.
which is over in the other place, as they call it, over in the Senate. Conservative Senator Nancy Ruth at the end of last week, made a speech on Senator Nicole Eaton's little inquiry into foreign money.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really interesting to see a conservative senator go after another conservative senator over this very pet project that the government has really been pushing lately. I mean, you will notice in the budget that there is now going to be this push to investigate charities over the foreign funds they receive. And for a member of their own caucus to call them out on it and say, are you simply saying that we shouldn't allow people whose points of view we disagree with not to get their own funding? Are you saying that that these groups in Canada wouldn't necessarily hold these opinions if it hadn't been for these foreign funds? For her to actually come out against her own caucus and put that out there, I think was really something we don't see a lot and should kind of pay attention to.
Okay. What about your loser of the week?
My loser of the week, I'm going to say, is Julian Fantino, or the M4 unit, as I like to call him on the Twitter machine. That's an old Star Trek reference for those of you who don't get it. Partially because procurement was his baby. I mean, this was supposed to be the file that he was put in charge of. He was supposed to be the grown-up on the file based on his years of experience with the police forces doing their own kind of procurement processes. And as we can see from the Auditor General's report, it looks like he's been invisible in this entire process, that his only role has been to stand up in question period and mechanically deliver those talking points in that kind of original Star Trek computer, clunky. You can hear the circuitry whirring behind him
moving.
As he's forcing out these talking points. So I think really he's basically proved his own obsolescence to keep up with the computer lingo.
I like that language. So for me, I think the winner of the week is probably cancer research.
Yes.
The Trudeau-Brazeau fight was something to behold, but for a whole bevy of awkward reasons. So regardless of the outcome, and there was a winner and loser in that outcome for
yes,
sure.
there was.
I'm going to say the winner of the week is Cancer Research, and I believe the final sum raised for that charity event was $250,000.
Somewhere around that, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, hats off to them. I really hope they do something different next year. My loser of the week, and I feel bad kind of saying this because I respect the decision he made. Charlie Angus, the NDP member of Parliament,
Yeah.
has decided to leave the Twitterverse this week.
Yes, and he's made a virtue out of it.
Yes, he's told anyone and everyone that would listen. I've heard some of his reasons for leaving, and I agree with them. And I think it's quite novel in this day and age when people don't do something they don't want to do. It's that simple.
Yeah.
However, he's my loser of the week for the simple reason that, he was concerned that there's racism and negative people on the internet. And I thought, wow, walk a mile in my shoes, Charlie Angus. Walk a mile in my shoes. I cry a lot, but grow some thicker skin because it sounds like he may be crying a lot more than I do. So that said, Twitter wishes you bon voyage, Charlie Angus. And please feel free to come back when you feel that there's a bit more positive energy in the world. Yeah. So that said, that ends our conversation for this week.
It does.
But we'll be back at you. I won't give you a time. I'll let you anticipate our next posting.
All right.
So
the house isn't sitting for the next 2 weeks, so there may not be a lot of action in there.
It'll be a quiet week, but that said, it'll give us a little bit more leeway in terms of what we talk about. So for this week, Destin Lord, Dale Smith, the Lord and Smith Commission signing off.
Have a good night.